Hey guys, this is the Think and Grow Rich podcast. My name is Bart Baggett. I am the co host of Hack and Grow Rich podcast. I think I said Think and Grow Rich. You know, you should think and you should grow rich, but this is the Hack and Grow Rich, and this is the show where you're going to learn shortcuts to cash flow, entrepreneurship, but more importantly, happiness along the journey. Now, my co host is an amazing human being named Shaheen Shahan, and his life is documented in an upcoming book and podcast called Billion. It's available later this year, and it's just an incredible life story. And the guest we have today has an equaling and amazing life story. So it's going to be one of the best episodes. So Shaheen, you're one of the most highly sought after Amazon seller consultants. Dozens of your brands do millions of dollars a month, and you do it all through hacking. Welcome to your own show, buddy.
Great to have you on, Bart. And ladies and gentlemen, we've got Bart Baggett, the successful life coach and author of Success Secrets of the Rich and Happy, teaching people that it is not just important to be rich, but you need to be happy while you're doing it. And in fact, I would argue that the only way to be happy is to be rich.
Well, we're going to ask our guest that same questions. He's walked many, many miles in many gurus' shoes, including his own. We usually chit chat a little bit, but I got to tell you, I'm so excited about who we have on today because I think the stories alone could fill up 6 hours. And I know he's got a lot of articles written about him. But our guest today, he's just commonly called Prince Stash. And that's probably because most of our Americans can't pronounce his entire name correctly because he's from European aristocracy. But our next guest has literally been on the celebrity pages since he was discovered at the Cannes Film Festival in 1959. Now, do the math on that. This guy has some wisdom to share. He's played with the most famous bands, including the Everly Brothers, the Platters. He's hung out with the Beatles, played on stage, and was literally part of that group in the 60s with the Rolling Stones. But we're not going to talk only about his celebrity status in the 60s and 70s. But, you know, he is from an amazing family. His dad is a world-famous expressionist, surrealistic painter known as Balthus. You know, Prince Stash paved his own way into the hippie cultures of the 60s. But that's not what we're talking about today. In the last 50 years, he wrote a book called The Golden Game. He has a zest for life. He's on a very spiritual path. And I think it's fair to say he's still traveling the world like he was in the 60s, spreading a unique life perspective. So Prince Stash, welcome to the show, and thank you for being here.
So you're going to need to unmute yourself.
Yep, that's it. You can hear me?
Yep, we can hear you just fine. Welcome.
How was that introduction? Did I cover everything you've done in the last 2 decades?
Well, it's hard to do, but you did a chunk of it. Let's put it this way.
You were most famous in your biographies for being a leader in this amazing, what would have been called a hippie culture in the 60s. And I don't think most people realizing, especially those listening under 40, the Rolling Stones and the Beatles were rebels. You were an outcast. You were a hippie. You got arrested for no reason. You did drugs. These things were completely different in 2021. What drew you to that entire cultural and music back in the 60s? And how does this still play a role in your life?
Well, I really was plucked out of high school by persuaded, and thank God my mother approved, and I got out of the drudgery on Via Veneto in Rome, actually, before the Cannes thing, with the Luchino Visconti's assistant, who was called Jerry Makczukowski, and he persuaded my mother to let me do a screen test for Vides films. Little did I know that, you know, there was sort of stars in the air, but I was a very pretty boy, and there was a lot of heavy secondary intentions. Let's just put it this way, that I know exactly what it's like to be a beautiful young girl that people lust after, because I was plunged in a world that my background had made slightly difficult to know how to deal with, but I managed to navigate these shark-infested waters successfully and had fun doing it. And therefore, I was involved in the sort of the Dolce Vita and the film world and the whole thing, hanging out as a teenager at Alain Delon's house near at Tancrou, near Paris, and so on and so forth, dancing with Romy Schneider and people like, having the time of my life. I went with Bellini to the 13th Cannes Film Festival in 1960, actually, when the Dolce Vita won the Palme d'Or. And as a result of that, I went to Hollywood. I went to New York first, one of the very first time I set foot in America in 1960. I arrived in Hollywood with a letter of introduction to Sammy Goldwyn Jr., who then ran the Goldwyn Studios. And I was immediately taken in and had a very privileged position, was able to do a whole host of incredible things, and including during that year, 1963, bluffing my way into a script writing job at Columbia, at Columbia Studios, which then had premises on Gower Street in Hollywood. And during the course of this assignment, for a man called an Oscar-winning director called Dennis Sanders, I discovered, the occupant of the next office and I both discovered and were curious about one another. So we both unlocked at the same time the dividing wooden panels that was dividing our offices, and it was John Cassavetes. And John Cassavetes came, but we would spend our time, we would do a bit of work and then we would sit cross-legged on the carpet and sort of build castles in Spain as to what kind of films we wanted to make and see and so on and so forth. It was an amazing time. However, when I came back, this is to draw the picture. When I came back to Europe, I found myself in Paris at quite a loose end in that I couldn't find an interesting job in the industry or in theater. And I had a great friend who was a legendary rock star, was called Vince Taylor. And he said, well, you've always been in the music and we've been friends for a long time. Why don't you join my band? That's how it started. I played with Vince Taylor on this incredibly amazing tour in early 65, which was trailblazing in so many ways. In fact, I just discovered a couple of days ago that I'm in a dictionary of extraordinary exotic people who visited Torremolinos. And it was because I had such unusual looks and long hair and earrings and a black glove and the whole thing, and was photographed, and they found the whole package irresistible, so got a lot of press in those days. Then we returned from this tour to headline with the Rolling Stones at the Paris Olympia during a series of gigs that took place over the Easter weekend of 1965. That's when there were maybe 10 or 15 acts on the bill playing maybe one song. There was a magician, there was a whole thing. Then we did our full set, which was all of 20 minutes. And then there was an intermission and the Stones came on.
Hold on. You were a new artist. You had just entered into the scene, and you got invited to open for the fucking Rolling Stones?
We didn't open for them. We were fighting them. We were in a battle of the bands. And Vince Taylor was a super. It wasn't a new artist. Vince Taylor was a massive star when the Rolling Stones were starting. And in fact, he wrote probably most people don't realize, but two facts about Vince Taylor, apart from his amazing, he was the craziest motherfucker you could possibly imagine. And Vince Taylor wrote Brand New Cadillac, which the Clash on their London is Calling album covered, and countless other bands. And he was also the inspiration for David Bowie's Ziggy Stardust.
Oh, wow.
And so I was in the band, and my influence in the band was that he went from being a sort of Gene Vincent, a sexier Gene Vincent, in black leather clothes and so on, to being a more new romantic type of person. And I was his $1 million gimmick, as he said, with glitter and long hair and barefoot on stage, and
unbelievable.
And the girls would sing. Yeah.
So were you back in those days before you were how old in 1966 when your first album
22.
came out? You were 22. Before that, did you come? I know your dad, his art sells for millions and millions of dollars, and Bart, is very familiar with him. I've just got a cursory understanding, but I know he's got art at the MoMA, at the London Museum, before his passing.
Metropolitan,
at the Metropolitan, and his stuff goes for millions and millions of dollars now. Did you come from a family of means? Were you wealthy growing up? Did you go to private boarding schools and were always well looked after?
Yes, I would say yes. I had very much I lived what resembled 19th, if not an 18th century education, and lived in these very grand estates and beautiful houses with extraordinary trappings, etc. Money was never discussed, really. In fact, it was considered terrible manners to talk about money. But I did go, and the great thing was I was such a misfit that I didn't do very well at school and got into, and I had a skiing accident after which I missed a whole term. And as a result of that, I was sent to a tutor in England, who was a marvelous man, a writer called Eric Otto Sipman. And he was a real renegade who'd written Confessions of a Nihilist, Waterloo on Wardour Street. He'd been in the film business. He'd been the lover of Tallulah Bankhead, etc. And he'd absconded into the west part, into the wildest part of the West Country in England, in Devonshire, on the edges of Dartmoor, to a ramshackle Victorian house that they were renting. And therefore, the tuition that he got from my parents was invaluable to his living. And he said, listen, I'm quite unqualified to teach you the curriculum, although I pretended that I could. But if you don't blow the whistle on me, I'll give you an education that you will know for the rest of your life. And so it was very much the classics and Greek and Latin and literature and things like that in both English, French, Latin, etc. And so it was a fantastic way. And I had lessons in the morning, rode my horses in the afternoons, worked on a nearby farm, got into rock and roll very early because there was some cute girls from a very rich family who had the only television set probably in the whole of West Country.
How old were you at this point?
At that time.
How old were you
I
at this
was
point?
14.
And what year was this?
And so there was this entire this show called on Saturdays called 6-5 Special, and I literally rode my horse through the snow and everything because the roads were unpractical, to never miss this show ever on Saturday. And it was a rock and roll show. And rock and roll in those days was like such a sort of marginal thing, you know, that it was very frowned upon, you know, because there'd been riots and all this kind of thing. It was before Elvis went into the army. And
we're talking late 1950s. We're talking late 1950s.
We're talking about 1957, 56, 57, that kind of thing.
Were you getting laid as a teenager because you were just super rich and like hanging out in these big houses and there were like beautiful young ladies around? You were just this like strapping young man?
Laid was very difficult, but I did manage it relatively early with a very beautiful neighbor, the daughter of a neighbor who was a great alluring beauty and very much sought after. And she decided that after I came back from Rome, I mean, probably in it was by that time, it was early 1960s. She decided that if I hadn't been late before, she wanted to be the first one to initiate me into the joys of sex, and I was an idiot at first because I tried to brag, and she said, "Oh, in that case, wait a minute, if you're saying you've already done it, no dice." So I had to break down in tears and sort of say, "No, I'm lying," and all that. She said, "Who's to believe what now?" and so on. And then it happened, and it was the most marvelous poetical experience, obviously, because It wasn't, you know, the usual dreadful, sordid thing that many young men in those days experience.
Let me ask you a question about men in general. It has been said that the only reason we do everything we do, whether make money, drive cool cars, is to get the attraction of women. Obviously, that's different if you're gay. But since you were 14, you've been good looking and you've had this. And I've read articles where you're posing with naked playmates and you've dated the top models from the 60s and 70s and movie stars. So you've obviously been highly motivated and very successful with women. Of all the famous people you know, do you think that's still the motivation, or is at some point, like you, the spiritual path becomes more important than the validation and the pretty girls?
Well, in those days, I used, Keith Richards accuses me in his book of having been this mystical figure, all in the service of a leg over, he says. But it's not true, because I never, ever talked in esoteric terms to girls because it bored me stiff to talk about matters that people didn't understand to other people. And to girls, I had learned how to do things. I had very, very good teachers, you know, as a teenager. I fell in love with the wrong ones, who were in love with older people, etc. I rejected stupidly the advances of somebody as beautiful as Françoise d'Orléac, who was Catherine Deneuve's older sister, who was an incredibly beautiful movie star, who was tragically killed in a car crash. But then I learned, and when I read Steppenwolf by Hermann Hesse, there's a wish you can have in the book, which is all the girls are mine. So at a very early age, I decided that's it, all the girls are mine. And indeed they were from that moment on, and it was the motivation. You know, I always quote Lord Byron Byron's verse in Don Juan, which says, I love the sex, and sometimes wouldst the tyrant's wish reverse, that mankind had but one neck, which he with one fell stroke might pierce. My wish is quite as wide, but much more tender on the whole than fierce, that womankind had but one rosy mouth to kiss them all at once from north to south. And that was my motto for the longest time. Obviously, in, you know, there comes a certain time in your late 70s, which I'm now entering. In a few months, I'll be 79. So,
Oh, wow.
The main thing then is, wait a minute, there's, you know, you do, oddly enough, I get a lot of strange advances from delectable young things, and I sort of tend to make excuses because, you know, you get into a lot of difficulties if you succumb to those type of temptations. There is, in fact, a very good novelette by Aldous Huxley called After the Fireworks, where a famous writer is has a beautiful young girl leaving her fiancé to be with him, and she runs him around so ragged that he engineers for her fiancé to come and take her back. I very heartily recommend reading this tale.
I love that.
So I'm a bit,
So let's take a look. I want to share something with you guys. Can you guys see my screen now? Let me know when
yeah.
We can see the screen.
You can see the screen. Okay.
It's black at the moment.
Yeah, that's okay. So we are getting ready to play, and let's give it a shot. So who is this guy right here?
Yeah.
So we're gonna watch this. So this is obviously a video from the 1960s. There you are, moving in. Looks like to the back of a police car with some very official looking Men in Black type situation there.
Very, very dragnet.
Very dragnet, right? So tell us what was going on there in that video.
Okay. Brian Jones, I was meant to do a film in Hollywood with...
Sorry. Okay, go ahead. One more time, please.
I was meant in those... I was staying with Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, who was in fact the key, the linchpin to the architect of a lot of the... He made those early hits like Painted Black and Lady Jane and Ruby Tuesday, absolutely immortal songs due to his multi-instrumentalist skills and his genius. And we had become friends since that time I just told you about in Paris. He was the one who came forward, and we shook hands, and I took him and all the girls. And in fact, I was with Anita Pallenberg at that time, who was to be the love of his life eventually. And I took him around. So we were very close friends. And in '67, he invited me to stay with him on my way to Hollywood. Then he asked me to defer my plans and to go with him to the Cannes Film Festival, hoping that I could help him reclaim her affections and woo her away from his bandmate, Keith Richards, with whom she'd absconded. He said, do you think I have a chance of getting her back? I said, well, I don't see why not. We could try. And so he demanded that I go to Cannes with him because he'd done the music of a director called Volker Schlendorf's a German movie, whose English title was A Degree of Murder, which starred Anita Pallenberg. And Volker Schlendorf is a was an extraordinary director. He did The Tin Drum, among other things, and so on. Anyway, they said, look, please come, because if you don't come, he's not going to come, and so on. So finally, reluctantly, I deferred my departure, went with him to Cannes. Following Cannes, we went to Paris together, and then returned to London. And the night that preceded the clip you've just seen, when we awoke late in the morning and the papers were delivered to us, the English papers, Mick and Keith were on all the front pages of everything, because they were being tried at Chichester on another outrageous bust with a few, it was completely trumped up charges, because the establishment was keen to decapitate the Rolling Stones. That morning, the phone rang off the hook with literally 30, 40 phone calls from the press asking, have you been busted? And we said, no, what the hell are you talking about? And they said, and then we began to suspect that perhaps the police had tried to come, and that we hadn't woken up. And but there was such a press type thing that we never thought of anybody else coming to the whole thing was too absurd to consider. And we never thought of looking around to see. We knew that we had no drugs that particular day, but we hadn't suspected that there might be planted material. And so the police managed, through a stratagem, to gain entry, because we were awaiting a man called Robert Fraser's servant who was coming to clean up that flat, and I buzzed him in, and when I went to open the door, it was in fact what I at first glance took to be a pack of journalists, but it was the cops armed with a search warrant. And in short order, they unearthed a ridiculous-looking Moroccan wallet under Brian Jones's bed, and none of us recognized having ever seen that before, so it was obviously very suspect. Then they combed this entire huge apartment on Courtfield Road, now demolished. The whole building, the whole neighborhood is completely transformed. But be that as it may, the only thing they found was an empty, very small vial about this size, and by holding it in the light, you could see a crystal or two. But even the leading detective said, oh, I'm not going to charge you for that, am I? What could be in there? We said, oh, I wouldn't like to know what's been in there. And we said, what? And he said, cocaine. We went, oh, no, and he said, well, I'm not going to charge you for that, because thousands of a grain. And we thought, oh, good. Well, still, we were both charged with cocaine possession, and then a moldy bottle of old methadone left by Anita Pallenberg in an old trunk, which not even the most desperate junkie could have used. Anyway, to make an extremely long story short, due to the establishment's desire to decapitate the Rolling Stones, perceived at that time incredibly as a menace to society, they had the police, to document the raid, they had told the press, and they told the TV. What we just saw was a clip from the television crew installed across the road, and that clip of us being taken to Chelsea police station, we were later on released. The whole thing was absurd. There were hundreds of reporters, and the whole thing, the police themselves suggested that we had the rules and the chauffeur come to the front while we absconded through the back door of the police station into a black cab that took us to the Hilton, London Hilton. And we ended up in Alan Klein's penthouse suite, where we saw what you've just shown was on the television on the 6 o'clock news.
And did you get out of jail
So,
finally?
you know, the whole thing. Sorry?
Did you get out of jail? Did the charges get dropped? What happened at the end?
Oh, that was a long song and dance. So it took 3 court appearances. Well, there was 2 initial court appearances, and the third one was when I arrived at the third one, which was the trial by jury on October the 30th. They said they are dropping the charges against you. So I rushed to Brian's side and I said, "We've won the case. You've got to plead." And he said, "I'm pleading guilty." I said, "Are you completely insane? This is absurd. Don't do that." And we're not guilty of any of those charges, and we can win and get immense amount of compensation. But he wouldn't. He'd been brainwashed by his legal team, who considered him guilty from the beginning, and he had a weird sense that he was atoning somehow, and stupidly he pleaded guilty, and that was the first step towards the grave for Brian Jones, who was then persecuted endlessly, took refuge into prescription drugs and so on, and that less than 2 years later he was in his grave.
Wow. So okay. So I know Bart's got some questions too. I want to get through one important one. So the title of our show, and I know guys, for all you listeners and viewers watching this, we've gone a little bit off topic here. Generally, the topic of our show is Hack and Grow Rich. And so we talk about that. And there's a reason why we have you on. And I think that you are a fascinating human being who's lived a lot of life, and that you, at this stage in your life, almost approaching 80, have a lot of wisdom to share. And I get this a lot from this particular question that I'm going to ask you. I get this a lot from young people who are kind of finding their way into the world now and are seemingly lost in an ocean of sound and noise, and they can't really figure out their way to success. So you came from pretty wealthy means. You came from a life of luxury in general, but then you managed to get your way into a world of music and fame, which those two things, just because you have money doesn't mean that you will connect with people who are at the highest echelons in the world. So now you, as approaching your 80th birthday, looking at perhaps some younger people who are our viewers and listeners, perhaps, there's a young person out there who wants to become a musician or record producer or an artist, right? And maybe they're starting with less than what you had. How did you do it? Because you hacked something. You did something unusual that endeared you into a universe of these top players. I mean, you were friends with Syd Barrett, one of the founding members of Pink Floyd. You were friends with Mick Jagger and Brian Jones and the Rolling Stones and Vince, and all these great people were attracted to something you had and something you did. So if somebody wants to learn your formula, if they come to you and they say, "Oh, wise master Prince Stash, educate me, teach me how I can become like you or become a better version of myself and have this access, have this type of success in life," how would you recommend that they do that? Like, what are some practical tips that you can offer?
It's very difficult to give any kind of practical tips, because you're looking at things that happened over 50 years ago, and the conditions were so radically different. You know, there was no internet, no cell phones, no social media of any kind. And the things one did and didn't do, you know, there was a sort of brotherhood of people who were mavericks of society, if you will, and people who were elected to be long-haired artists were persecuted for the way they looked. We blazed an amazing trail for the future, you know, people with green hair and piercings and the rest of it. I guarantee you that, you know, none of that would have been socially acceptable if we hadn't fought for those rights. It was, you know, there's a sort of, the 60s are viewed through rose-tinted glasses. Yes, there was free love. Yes, there was this and that. But it was not at the expense of having the establishment forever picking on you in your daily displacement. People would challenge you at customs, investigate your bona fides, etc. They would constantly stop you in a car and so on and so forth. So, you know, I became friends with close friends with the Beatles because in the aftermath of that particular arrest, you know, Paul McCartney called me and said, "I'm sending a car. I'm sending a car. You're coming to live at my house, and if they want to arrest you again, they'll have to take me as well." So there was this sort of solidarity, and this I was taken under the Beatles' wings and participated in sessions with them, etc., due to the peculiar circumstances that happened. It was, in a way, it's fate that, you know, these things happened. I don't think you can say, well, there's a way to do this, you know, because at every step of the way, there's always a fork in the roads. You take the right path or the left path, and you're going to have different outcomes. How would you advise somebody, a creative, content creator today? I think the only thing that, in essence, you have to say to people, be yourself, make it your own. And this was imparted to me by no less a personage, very much maligned, but a great musical genius, was Ike Turner. You know, Ike Turner told me, he said, "Can you play guitar?" And I said, "Oh, I can't, because, you know, I made all sorts of stupid excuses that I had these friends like Jimi Hendrix and Eric Clapton and etc., and they were better. And when I learned to play guitar, Mick Jagger got on better than me, etc." He said, "Nonsense, you got to abandon all that and make it your own." And that's how I developed being able to play all those instruments, was from this. And I would impart the same thing to any content creator. Never heed somebody else's opinion of your work. Whatever it is that you hold dear and that you're doing in this creative matters, you've got to stick to your guns and make it your own, whether it's commercial or not. My father never painted in the abstract medium. He remained exactly on the course that he'd set, and he wasn't always successful. I mean, in commercial terms, but suddenly the wind filled his sails, and he became immensely successful and sought after, but he never wanted to do that.
Do you still have a collection of your father's works?
I do. In fact, due to my advancing age and due to estate planning, Christie's is organizing in October in Paris a sale of a great part of my collection, apart from some personal items, because it's difficulties for my heirs otherwise if anything happens to me. And the main thing is, I'm fine right now, but at my age, you have to expect that you might not wake up in the morning, one day, and it's fine. It's totally cool, but you need to have certain things in place that will make life for one's heirs a little better.
You have kids?
I have one son.
And what's he do?
He's a professional U.S. Marine.
Oh, wow.
Dangerous
Yeah.
hero work.
And when people, before you say, oh, how is it possible in your artistic family? Well, on my mother's side, my grandfather was and came from a long line of warlords and people who had their own private armies and fought in the service of every crown and accumulated titles and everything from all over, and a fortune from all these mercenary activities. But my grandfather was in World War I, was the head of Helvetic intelligence, the intelligence bureau in Switzerland, and he was educated at Heidelberg University, was very much a von Stroheim type, that von Stroheim would have portrayed in these type of films, with a dueling scar and everything. And he was a high-ranking officer, so there is a tradition in part of my maternal family of that sort of thing.
I have a question about the spiritual path. You and I have something in common. We've spent years in India and have many, many friends there. But you mentioned in one of the interviews that one of the only people you consider a guru, because you had hundreds of them, is Sadhguru of the Isha Foundation. As you get closer to the end of this journey, does that help with you understanding the reincarnation or the past lives, the spiritual bases? Like, what did you learn from your India experiences that we could take away from?
Well, first of all, I was fortunate. I went to India. I turned down doing a major tour with a band I was a lead singer in called the Rakes, and with an RCA contract and the whole thing, because I felt the need, and it was inspired, I must say, by these transcendent psychedelic journeys. And I was compelled to follow, to use the title of a book that had a lot to do with it, Lama Govinda's Way of the White Clouds. And I wanted to go to India, and I wrote to a spiritual master called Maharaj Charan Singh in the Punjab at Beas, and he said, come to me immediately. And in fact, in those days, you didn't have to spend a dime on these type of things. They didn't sell programs, they didn't do. In fact, you were invited to stay in considerable comfort if you were a long-distance traveler and you'd come over land and so on and had made the effort to be there. You could make a donation, but it wasn't requested by any stretch of the imagination. And I wanted to, while I was in India, and following that particular thing, I wanted to go on. I found a book in the library at this place called The Pilgrim's Guide, which wasn't for foreigners. It was just written partly in Hindi and in English, because English being the lingua franca in a place with so many idioms. And I read of a man who led yogi caravans into Tibet in a place place in the Himalayan foothills called Nainital. So I directed my steps towards that place. And when I arrived, unfortunately, and I had planned it, the whole thing, that I would go without any kind of document, darkened skin, a sort of Sir Richard Burton, type of adventure, and would be a deaf-mute pilgrim, and and join this yogi caravan. But the man who was organizing the whole thing died just before I got there. And when I got there, they broke it very gently. Unfortunately, Swamiji's has departed this plane of existence. And I was at a loose end, and I remembered that somebody had said that in another place called Almora, not too far from there as the crow flies, but very far in the Himalayas, was the Kazal Devi Ashram, where Lama Govinda dwelt. And since Lama Govinda had been such an important influence in my life, I journeyed there, and most of the journey from Almora Bazaar was then on foot for many Himalayan miles. And I had to wait to gain, to be able to ring the door, because they didn't want any callers before sundown and so on. And when I went there, I introduced myself, and he said, oh, I know exactly who you are. And he sort of swiveled on his heel, picked up a book, in one flawless movement, and opened it. And it was a book of Rilke, Rainer Maria Rilke's correspondence. And he opened it, and to a letter from Rilke to André Gide, where he mentioned the family. And he goes, so Lama Govinda looks at me and he says, De Rola, right? And I said, yes. And he had it right there, the whole reference. And I became his special chela, special student in the esoteric Tibetology, as it were. And from then, from all the weeks and months that ensued until my return to Europe, I was a way through all this exotic Tibetan and Hindu yogi type of teachings to turn back towards Western esotericism and towards childhood and early adolescence love of mine, which was alchemy. And I took doing the several projects from, that's a whole long story of how this came about. But I was then invited by Thames and Hudson to do a book in their Art and Imagination series on alchemy. And I worked on it. Oddly enough, I bypassed doing a tour as a percussionist for the Rolling Stones, because I felt if I go on that one, I'll never finish this book. And indeed, it was a useful thing. That it came out in 1973. And the French version of it, which I rewrote in French in 1974, both books were very, very successful.
Amazing.
And then they asked me to another, I did another couple of projects for them.
So,
and yeah.
Yeah, let me ask you this. So we're going to do 3 rapid fire questions. And I think that's super amazing. I mean, imagine, guys, if you are at a place where you have a higher calling, that the Rolling Stones, the fucking Rolling Stones, Mick Jagger is on the other line with his British accent asking you to come be the drummer. And you're like, nah, I think I want to go work on my book, right? That takes discipline, right? That takes balls. And you, my friend, have balls. So 3 rapid fire questions as we wrap this up at the end of this episode. So are you ready, Prince Stash?
I am indeed.
Question number 1, your favorite song of all time?
that's a hard one. Whiter Shade of Pale.
That's a really good song.
Harem.
That's a really good song.
Well,
Question number 2. Number of women you've slept with between 1959 and now.
Question mark. I gave up counting after 1,000 or so.
1,000. Okay, he's 80. The guy's 80 years old almost. So
lot more than 1,000.
I have question 3.
Go ahead, Bart.
Is it true that you passed on the lead role in the Monkees TV show because you hated the script?
The script was so bad. I mean, they had Bob Rafelson and Bert Snyder had said it would be like Hard Day's Night every week. And the pilot script was so paltry by the time they brought it to me at this mansion we had on St. Ives Drive in Hollywood that I said, "Come, are you serious? I don't want to do this." Plus, one was so young. I was still 22. And I thought the contract you had to sign was, and I thought this thing will never get on the air and I'll be entangled in this thing. And it was, it was such garbage. This
so that
pilot,
is true.
You
So guys, I want to bring it back to this as we close out. And, Prince, we're going to give you the last few words. So whatever you want to share with the audience. But what I want to say is this is a person, a human being who's lived a life of meaning, and that has value. But most importantly, look at the person that we're talking to here. And this is one of the things I admire most about you. And I see this in Bart too. But Prince, you being our guest today, is that you just don't give a fuck. And I think that is your secret. I think that is what endeared you to the Beatles, the Rolling Stones. They just look at you, you don't give a fuck. You don't want anything from anybody. You are going to be you and be authentic like you were teaching us and do what you're going to do. And there is something incredibly attractive about that to people. There's something incredibly magnetic about that type of energy where you just don't give a fuck. It doesn't fucking matter. And now just looking at you, aside from, sure, you've got a lot of art, you came from, a family of means, you've got money or whatever, you have something that a lot of people strive for. That means more than the money and the material things. You get to do whatever you want, whenever you want, with whoever you want. And you've achieved a point in your life where you have that freedom. And that's what we teach here on Hack and Grow Rich. For anybody who's interested listening to this, guys, hit us up in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe to this channel, the Hack and Grow Rich channel, and my other podcast, Billion, How I Became King of the Thrill Pill Cult. If any of you guys are interested in selling on e-commerce, check out FBAsellercourse.com. And if you want a free $200 1-hour course on how to sell on Amazon, absolutely free, reach out to me directly by email. I'll share the email in the show notes, and I would be happy to share that with you guys for free. Use code PrinceStash. And Bart, if people want to get a hold of you and become rich and happy, or happy and rich, what is the way they could do that?
Or richer or happier or both. Hit me up on Instagram at Bart Baggett. And then if you want one of my latest books, they're free for our listeners. GetBartsBook.com. You can go to Amazon and buy them, of course. But I really think that a book is sort of a distillation of years and years of wisdom. So if you have a chance to go download that, the audiobook will be coming out soon. GetBartsBook.com. And thanks, Shaheen. This has been a great guest. I want to kick it back to Prince Stash. You've been one of the most fascinating guests. Is there any final words of wisdom you can leave us as you've lived 78 years on this planet?
Words of wisdom. It is very important to know that you can reach a completely different level, which I've termed the absolute elsewhereness of being, which is to link up with the divine. Note that I haven't said God, because that's a very misleading word. I've said the divine. And the divine is an infinite dimension, which so surpasses anything in the temporary world, that anything resembling not happiness. Happiness. It's difficult to be happy in a world where people are unhappy, but certainly joyful bliss. You can attain this bliss by tuning into this other dimension of yourself. And what are the keywords to that? You've got to be ego-free, not ego-less. On the contrary, you can have, and I have a particularly good superego, but you need to be ego-free. That's a mask I put on. And, whatever it is, whatever the appellation, the playboy, the whole thing, all these are masks. The one thing is this ego freedom to reach beyond into, and where is it? It's not out there, it's within. And everything is within oneself. And the way most misleading paths are those where one is looking outwardly for things. If one concentrates within, one will obtain mastery of the outside world. Because, as Lama Govinda quite well put it, when I asked him, what is the outside? And he said, the outside is the inside veiled in mystery, which is a very beautiful and poetical way to put it. And think about it.
I love that. The outside is the inside veiled in mystery. All right, guys. Thank you so much for listening in. We are now at our time. Bart, thank you so much. Prince Stash, honored to have you on, my friend. And hopefully we can have you on again to share some of your great wisdom and insane stories of a life well lived. Thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate being able to talk about these matters that are meaningful.